I will speak up so no microphone is required. And I will also tell you that if there's at any point something that's unclear, then I'm happy to entertain questions or comments. I'm going to draw a rather large picture of a world that is related to this person, Zelig Harris, and in so doing, ask a number of questions about the Israel-Palestine situation by looking back, in particular to the 1930s. So I'm going to tell a rather broad story to begin, and as you will see, as the various pictures and notions and suggestions come into focus, we will end up addressing the question of Israel-Palestine from this quite historical standpoint. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about this person. Zelig Harris is probably most well known for having taught Noam Chomsky in the university. And people who are interested in Chomsky have perhaps heard the name, but the associations with him are not clear. I just got back from a talk that I gave in the linguistics department, and he's very well known in the realm of linguistics for having, if you wish, invented discourse analysis and what is called transformations. But most people only know him from that vantage point. I will only briefly mention that work today, because he was also involved in a number of other projects that concern us here today, and that have not been brought to light for reasons that I will tell you about, relating to his own fear of being arrested in the United States for his radicalism. But don't let me get ahead of myself. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about this man. Zelig Harris was born in 1909 in Balta, Russia. They call themselves Russian. It was, of course, in the Ukraine. He was born in 1909, and his family came over. He was 4 years old when his family came to Philadelphia, and he studied and did well. He had one brother named Zvi and two sisters, all of whom were very much interested in questions of science and of education. Their parents, their father, Hyman, owned a drugstore and became quite affluent and successful in the Philadelphia community, to the point where they had a house that was big enough to hold Friday night services for the local Jewish community. Although the family itself was not religious in the way that many Jewish families are culturally active but more or less secular, he nonetheless held these services downstairs in the house. And Zelig was therefore raised with knowledge of Jewish cultural affairs and an interest in the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language, which had been taught to him by his parents. The belief that they had was that the future of Zionism would be a future of the Jewish people speaking in Hebrew and not in Yiddish. This is an important point to make, because Zelig Harris eventually lands up becoming a linguist, and Hebrew becomes his early focus in his studies of Semitic languages at the University of Pennsylvania. So the connection to Judaism, therefore, really is only through the cultural work and eventually then through the language work. The focus upon Hebrew as the particular language of study, I think, is significant, and it may be one of the answers to the questions of why so many linguists and linguistic anthropologists from the 20th century have been Jewish. Every name up here now, Edward Sapir, Franz Boas, Leonard Bloomfield, are all Jews and all involved in linguistics, cultural linguistics, anthropological linguistics, and they were ostensibly the inspiration for Zelig Harris in his work. The other interesting point of connection between these individuals was their radicalism. All four of them were anti-status quo. Zelig Harris, as you will see, was sympathetic with certain notions of Marx, and more particular with scientific socialism. His two avowed influences in the anthropological linguistics in particular were Bloomfield and Sapir, and you see both of them here. The next area that was of interest to Zelig-Harris was the transformation of capitalist society towards a formation that would reflect some of the ideas that were promoted by people like Anton Pannekoek, the Dutch astronomer, and a man who would eventually become a friend and colleague in New York City named Paul Maddock. Their notion was, and here's one of the strange and interesting connections with the language studies, their notion was that there is a scientific basis for certain renovations of society, that there are ways of modeling a future society which would be in accord with scientific principles. So even in his social attitudes, Zelig-Harris was very much the scientist, very much a believer in the idea that you could solve fundamental social issues through science. His linguistics work was devoted to the idea of applying scientific paradigms to the study of language, with the belief that he often uttered, particularly in the late 40s, that he was going to solve the problem of linguistics. And I can tell you, having just come from the Oxford Linguistics Department, I've got a good laugh, because here we are, still studying linguistics. All the questions, in a sense, are still to be posed. But you know, the belief in the power of science as a way to overcome complex issues. Same thing with Anton Pannekoek and the idea of worker self-management. Paul Maddock with an application of anti-Bolshevik Marxism, the sense that that science could be brought to the factory floor to better organize workers, and in particular to change workers' attitudes about their relationship to the means of production. That was a crucial concern in a kind of second area of his work. The third area of his work is in mathematics, and his tremendous interest in mathematical models and physics models. And to that end, he, like so many young boys and then men of his generation, revered, idolized, and perhaps wanted to be Albert Einstein. And when I first started working on this book, I actually thought that what he had done in order to live up to this dream that he had of becoming Einstein was that while Einstein was at Princeton, he had gotten to know his principal assistant, who was a mathematician named Gurion Kaufman, and through his friendship with Gurion Kaufman, who was also Palestinian, was able to get close to Albert Einstein. This turns out to be both true and false. It's false in the sense that Gurion Kaufman is also Zelig-Harris's first cousin. So when he married her, he was marrying somebody he knew. Furthermore, Gurion Kaufman had lived in the Harris household when she was a young woman who had just come over from Palestine to study music in New York. So this idea that he had tried to get close to Einstein through her may nonetheless still be true, but she was known. And again, the fact that she's Palestinian, the fact that her father himself was also a scientist, the fact that her father was involved in Jewish cultural affairs, and the fact that her father was also interested in language studies is, I think, a very interesting connection, as we shall see. The next area that Zelig-Harris was interested in was psychoanalysis. And he believed that through the study of psychoanalysis that it would be possible to understand how to motivate people to change their attitudes about, say, their relationship to the means of production, but other issues as well. So he was interested in social attitudes and the manipulation of social attitudes through propaganda and ways of dismantling propaganda to help people to better understand their interests. And again, you'll see how this becomes extremely important in questions of Palestine a little bit later on. His influence in this area, of course, was Freud, but in particular the influence was Erich Fromm, who had worked on the question of escape from freedom, a member of the Frankfurt School, and he, as you will see, became a great hero to Zelig-Harris. And finally, issues of socialist Zionism and social justice. And for this reason, Zelig Harris was very interested in, and eventually very close to, the work of Louis D. Brandeis, who was by then a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. He eventually would go and see Louis Brandeis in his apartment in Washington, D.C., and eventually, as you'll see, worked in an organization in which he would send people to go and work with Brandeis as well. All of these people, interestingly enough, come to be connected through a small Jewish organization founded at Harvard in 1925 as a social group to bring together Jews who felt as though their possibilities for friendships and so forth and so on, given the anti-Semitism of the milieu, would be in some ways essential. So VUCA was, in its founding moment at Harvard, a kind of Jewish social club. It spread like Facebook. This is the early Facebook, that's my film. It's a different social network. It spread through most of the major campuses in the Northeast, and then to California, down as far as Tulane, up as far north as McGill and the University of Toronto in Canada, and became this kind of social network that Jews would join if they hadn't joined some other, Hillel or Ashkenaz Zaire or something. Joined it, but interestingly, perhaps because of the time period, but also undoubtedly because of the power that was exerted upon the organization by Zelig Harris, the organization became quite radical. And it was radical in a number of ways. The most significant being that it believed that VUCA eventually proposed, particularly through its New York office, eventually proposed the idea of Jewish-Arab rapprochement, Jewish-Arab cooperation, and the founding of not a state, but a space in Palestine to which not Jews, but all oppressed people in the world would go. So the VUCA notion set forth in pamphlets originally, and then in newspapers that were distributed in the US and so forth from 1925, during the time of its existence up until the summer of 1943 when it was dissolved, was a program for American Jews. And this is a little known program. It's really why I'm so grateful for the invitation here. My list of reasons goes on for hours, but that's it. But I think that it's exciting to go back to history and ask the question of Jewish-Arab relations from this historical vantage point, because the people who came to be involved in this organization were some of the leading Jewish intellectuals, scientists, and personalities of that period. VUCA eventually had several thousand members. I've heard everything from about 2,000 to 5,000 members. Some of the major VUCA organizational centers included the University of Michigan, as far to the west as the University of California. But the central focus of the national VUCA group was in New York. And Zelig Harris was first a student and member of VUCA, and then a president of VUCA, the society, and then a faculty advisor to VUCA. And he took VUCA in this quite radical direction of not just a Zionism that was anti-statist, but a Zionism which was a first step towards a worldwide socialist revolution. Palestine, by becoming the place where Jews and Arabs and other oppressed peoples of the world recognize the nature of their oppressor, would expand outwards towards worldwide socialism. So it's
If you might ask the question,
please.
Quite understand. It is only for Jews. It's only an organisation for Jews.
Yes.
But its focus is on interaction with non-Jews. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. However,
no non-Jews allowed to belong.
Whether or not they were allowed, I'm not sure. I don't think that it was specifically denied. People would be specifically denied. I never saw any indication that there were people who were looking to join. It was an American student organization, but your question brings up a very, very central notion, that a word that will be of tremendous consequence all the way through here, which is the idea of the vanguard. The idea amongst the VUCA group, and in particular of Zelig Harris, was that he would form a vanguard of Jews who would then go to Palestine eventually. This is not unlike what you hear a little bit from Hashemar Hatzair, but with a different intention. A vanguard of Jews who would go to Palestine and help the Palestinians in the first instance, and then work towards assisting others later on to recognize who their true oppressors were. So, for example, one case that is given in the Avuka Student News is that the Jews need to go and make the Palestinians aware that the true oppressor was British Petroleum, who at that time was running pipes through Palestine, and who was an unbelievably terrible employer. Things have changed a lot, sort of thing. So BP, BP is the oppressor. That was the point to make. Palestinians and Jews should unite in fighting against BP. That was the crux of his article. But the question is a crucial one, because it provides to Jews a specific role, which is the role of the vanguard who would go over and kind of help people understand. Well, how do you help them understand? How do you develop their attitudes and so forth and so on? The way you do it is through the work that he was doing elsewhere. Social justice with Louis Brandeis, behavior modification through a better understanding of the mind with the work of Eric Fromm, and so forth. So it's a very intellectual enterprise that he comes to be involved in and tries to spread. I should also say to you that this organization had factions within it, that not everybody bought into this vision of the future, but that this was sort of the mainstream, the main set of assumptions, the guiding assumptions of Avuka, because of the important role that the New York office played, and because Zelig Harris ruled over the New York office. They did a whole series of publications, the most prominent being Avuka Student Action, because by the time Avuka Student Action came out, which is in the late 30s, the organization was really reasonably well established and so forth, but they also made pamphlets, and they did a few books in which they would put compendiums of ideas together and so forth. How do you get to know anything about Avuka, since nothing has ever been written about it? This was a challenge that was given to me. My first book in this series, this is the third in a series of books that I've written about this mid-year. The first book was Noam Chomsky's biography. But Noam Chomsky's biography was not supposed to be a biography. I had called the early version Noam Chomsky and His Early Milieus, because I wanted to write a book that would talk about the people who had influenced Chomsky. A lot of people who know something about Chomsky think that he came out of an egg, or he came out of another planet, or something like that. What I wanted to demonstrate was that a lot of his ideas have currency that can be traced backwards. And one of the places from which he's taken some of his ideas was Avuka. So I heard about this 20 years ago, this organization, and eventually a number of members of this organization suggested that I write a book about it, because it was so important and because so few people know anything about it. Over the years, I've interviewed every living member, and as the years have gone by, many of those living members are no longer with us, and have amassed all of this information. And some of the people who I've interviewed, who appear on this list, will for you perhaps be a little bit surprising. Perhaps the most surprising name that will be in front of you is Nathan Glazer. Nathan Glazer, who you may know as, in a sense, the founder with Irving Kristol of the neoconservative movement in the United States, one of the supporters of Bush for the White House, became a sociology professor at Harvard, extremely well known. His work is described wonderfully in a film called Arguing the World, which describes his involvement with the radical alcove at CCNY, the City College in New York, with people like Seymour Melman and so forth, and Irving Kristol, and Daniel Bell, and the radicals of the period. as it turns out, Nathan Glazer was not only a member of AVUCA, but he was a leading, perhaps the leading, eventually, member of AVUCA, who was supposed to take the torch. AVUCA actually means torch, so who was supposed to take the torch from Zelig Harris and lead them into the revolutionary future. He was a young student at City College in New York in the late 30s, early 40s, and he was groomed first as the editor of the AVUCA Student News, and eventually the managing editor of all of their publications. When I spoke with him, it's kind of fascinating to hear him talk, because despite his, the evolution of his ideas, when he talked about that period, you felt as though he was still there. So that might be a surprising name, but if you look to some of the other names on here, Norman Epstein became a chemist. Irving London founded the Albert Einstein Hospital in New York City, and also founded Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Medical Center. His portrait's up in the lobby. Willie Siegel became a biologist. Howard Orland became a very important writer and psychologist. And these are some of the people who I would interview to talk about the nature of this organization and some of the dreams that they had of Arab-Jewish cooperation and the like. The Arab-Jewish cooperation was particularly promoted by Zelig Harris, but also by Seymour Melman. Seymour Melman is the most prominent. His name is really small there, but he's the most prominent of the individuals who continued to promote AVUCA's ideals well into the 70s and then 80s, and he died in the late 80s.
Regards to the questions that...
So the question then becomes, if AVUCA is so little known, how do you get to know a little bit about it? And what I did was interviewed a whole series of people who have been involved with it. And I just want to show you a couple of the interviews so that you can get to know some of these people, so that when we come back to the issue of Arab-Jewish relations and Palestinian, we can have a sense a little bit of what it was like. Now, I'm beginning with Chomsky really because he's the thread that connects the different generations. So he was not actually a member of AVUCA, but it resonated with him in certain ways, and he knew of it, and he knew people who were in it, and of course, Zelig Harris being his director, he worked very, very closely with him. So it's interesting to hear his perspective.
Of Harris and AVUCA is because this is in the context of the many interviews that I've been doing with people from that world. And I guess that one thing that I've become concerned with is ensuring that that world's stories land up being told. And the stories are, as you know, amazing. But I in particular wanted to do the first one of you because 12 or 13 years ago, we sat in your old office and you suggested that I write about that stuff.
It's just the timing's perfect. A couple more years, everybody will be gone.
Yeah. So I guess
You did get Seymour.
did.
He's the most important person. Seymour kept it alive.
Yeah. So I guess the question I've been longing to ask. No, not yet. Not yet.
I remember something. He used to be pretty active with any kind of going
Yeah, I'm anxious too. I guess the question I wanted to ask you was, when we spoke all those years ago, and you suggested I write about and be concerned with Zelig Harris. So, why?
Why the
Yeah, what?
I came in sort of on the war was around, and you could see the framework of reference project had grown out of it, and the people were interesting people. I mean, Harris particularly, but others too. And I got to know Seymour and others, but you could just see that there was something pretty exciting going on. That in fact, as far as I know, a substantial number of young Jewish left intellectuals did pass through that, and they went all kinds of ways. Glazer kind of way off to the right. Seymour kept pretty true to the general picture they had. Most of them just dropped out, but it was plainly a formative experience that had a big effect on anybody who went through it. I met later in the 60s, and after I spoke to him for about 2 minutes, I asked him if he'd never met Zelig Harris. And he said, yeah, I didn't tell him. Yes, it did imitate mannerism.
Wow.
Harris was emotion to Zelig's characteristic.
So there's,
It's really been,
but also the moment at which this organization got started, it begins early on in 1928, but it takes on such importance in the 30s and through the world events. So one of the people with whom I've had discussions is Irene Schumer, and she said that a lot of the people who were originally gravitated towards the organization thought of it as a kind of Jewish social group. They were interested in Zionism and they were interested in some of the ideas that were floating around in discussions of Palestine. But then there was this added urgency that kind of grew year by year by year. So that obviously the
I
context.
don't know about her, but I think it was not just Zionism. It was also worker self-management, critique of the Russian Revolution. The 30s after all the very lively debates about all kinds of social issues. Ruka took an interesting position of kind of independent, like Paul Maddock, kind of a critical Bolshevism from the left, strongly critical from the left, which was not that existed, but they took a unique role.
And do you feel when you met and began to work with Zelig Harris, did he mention the work that had been done in the Auschwitz?
Well, I certainly knew about it very quickly. For one thing, in the background was this group that became the Frame of Reference group. They kept circulating materials. I wasn't part of the group, but materials were coming, we would read them, we would talk about them. And it was clearly an offshoot of what we were doing.
And then the framework.
So his connection to it was, of course, through the language studies, but also through this frame of reference project. And as you begin to fill in the contours of the story, you realize that the frame of reference project was a crucial component, not only of this idea of worker self-management and so forth, but also for changing the frame of reference within which people who were oppressed would operate. So once again, Zelig Harris was looking to solve certain questions. The question of linguistics was one that he believed he would solve with his structuralism. So linguistics was not to be a long-term problem, not to be a long-term concern. Of far more consequence was the problem of how to make workers aware that the owner of the means of production was in fact the enemy, not the Arab or the Jew or the whatever it was. That's to develop class consciousness was a crucial component of the vision that Zelig Harris had for the future of Palestine and for the future of Arab-Jewish relations. That Arabs and Jews would recognize that put on the same footing in terms of economic power through the work that they're doing at the Frame of Reference Project would allow for peace amongst Arabs and Jews, but also allow for the development of this region. And in one of the articles in the Avuka Student News, they talk about bringing Native Americans, African Americans, and people from India who are feeling oppressed and so forth to Palestine because of this shared relationship that they had as oppressed people. So, and again, the theory being that this was not to be a state. This was not to be a Jewish state. It was not even to be a state. It was to be a socialist region in which people who discovered that they shared values would expand outwards. As you'll see, in which there would eventually be a form of power sharing based on population. The next person I want to briefly interview with you here is Murray Eden. Murray Eden is extremely interesting for this story because he was a member of Avuka, a friend and co-worker of Zelig Harris, but he was also an engineer, became an engineering professor at MIT. in Boston, and was interested in some of the more hands-on issues and complexities and problems that were being named by, not only by the linguistics, but by some of the projects, some of the other projects with which he was involved. And I'll give you just a brief sense of his involvement with the VUCA here.
It's hard to say as I look how, consider how he and I and maybe Chet got involved with VUCA was because Chet and I certainly, and I don't remember Harold in that context, but we were working for the City College campus, the college newspaper. It was essentially controlled by YCL. And I recall very clearly one day, and I guess I was a junior, one of the editors there asked me to join the YCL. And I had no interest then, and so I did. Well, that sort of killed my career at the paper. And somebody approached me, and I don't remember who. Again, it probably was Rapkin. He said, well, there's this Jewish organization, and they have a paper, and would you like to work there? I said, sure, why not? I have nothing against Jews. Some remark. We didn't take the Zionism very.
You think the Zionism are very serious? I have nothing against Jews, he says. And again, he was a member of VUCA. And again, what's important also, I think, as we think about this project, this plan, this idea that VUCA had, was that to form this vanguard required an enormous amount of studying and reading and working and so forth. And that the students who were involved with it, who were young, between 17 and 21 or something like that, or younger probably at that time, did this in addition to their normal classroom work. And in fact, VUCA expected that only the best students would get involved in the organization, and they pushed them to ask these very difficult questions. So if you're involved with anti-fascism, and if you're involved with this form of Zionism, and if you're involved with Marxism and communism and so forth and so on, you have to do a lot of reading, a lot of working, and they would get together constantly, and they would go to summer camp together, and they would have friends and so forth and so on. But they also would write for the newspaper, as you hear here, where you get a chance at getting involved. The next one here is a guy named Zev Schumer. Zev Schumer was part of the Michigan VUCA. And I wanted to briefly bring him in here to say that there was not unanimity amongst the members that the VUCA plan, as proposed by Zelig Harris, that is to say, Jewish-Arab Rapprochement, a socialist state in Zion, in Palestine, strong Arab-Jewish relations, and the framework of reference project. It was not universally believed in as a project. It was very much believed in by the New York office. Furthermore, the organization was run in the early days by men. And what eventually happened to the organization was that women increasingly took leadership roles, because by 1942, American men were going off to fight the war, and the office was increasingly occupied by the young women of VUCA. You will hear the story of the most, I think, amazing person who was involved in this organization, a woman named Irene Schumer. That is his wife. I stayed in their house for a few days to do these recordings and so forth, and you'll see her very briefly. But what he's going to tell is the story of this organization and how he met his wife.
Yeah. members. It was a strong chapter, so, you know, I had the votes.
Right.
And then at one of the meetings, Irene was chairman. And she was very fair in conducting the meeting. She permitted everybody to talk, for which she got into trouble with her left-wing group. Afterward, they complained to her, how come you let everybody talk? What kind of crap is this democracy shit, you know?
Gurion was beside herself. She was jumping up and down like a jumping jack.
Anyway, as a result of that meeting, I was impressed with Irene. I had never met her before. I asked her out to dinner, and that was our first date.
That's on solid ground.
Yeah, that's right.
But here, I just want to point this out to you.
Here's my magnificent filmmaking skills.
Chapter of Abuka
There you go.
was in struggle with the Hillel at University of Michigan. The rabbi at the University of Michigan Hillel chapter was a communist. And the Abuka people were...
Communist Party. He was Communist Party or Communist?
Yeah, he was.
Well, something.
You know, a fellow trapper. I mean, what we call the fellow trapper.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
So no matter what divisions there were between the people in the New York office and the people who were out in the various chapters, the people in the chapters still had a point of view,
Sure.
which was a very specifically kind of a Buka point of view.
Right.
And that was why I think it's so interesting, you know, that they were willing to cut off people who didn't agree with them on every jot and tittle because
They deviated from the line.
Right.
So there was not unanimity in this organization on virtually any matter except anti-fascism, which really was the uniting force in the Abuka group eventually. And I must say on the Jewish-Arab, the question of Jewish-Arab relations, in which most Abuka members were strongly in favor of this notion of developing a plan whereby there would be Jewish-Arab cooperation. Now, not necessarily on the same socialist principles, as you can tell here, as what Zelig-Harris was looking for, but nonetheless, it was a crucial historical idea. Interestingly enough as well, in terms of male-female relations, was that Irene Schumer was destined to become the president of Abuka in 1942. And there was a meeting held by this organization to elect the new president, and by then, Al Khan and Seymour Melman and Harold Orleans and so forth had all gone off to war. So you were left with Ruthie Sager, who ended up marrying Nathan Glazer and then divorcing later on, and marrying Peter Gay, who you may know as the biographer of Freud. The number of connections in this community, I'm not even going into it, but it is it's absolutely amazing. So Ruthie Sager and Shoshana Harris, Zelig Harris's brother's wife, and Irene Schumer were going to take over Abuka. Zelig Harris therefore created plans for a coup in which the organization would instead be dissolved. Because Irene Schumer held the line that what was important was not worldwide revolution beginning with Palestine, but rather the saving of Jews from the Nazis. That has to be the new direction for Abuka. And since Harris knew that that was going to be the direction, he had the organization dissolved in a summer meeting in 1943. And to this day, Irene Schumer is bitter about this dissolution. And there was a reunion of Abuka members in, I think it was 1994, or somewhere around there, in which people who hadn't seen each other since that dissolution, in other words, for 50 years, got together in a room, and it actually came to a physical brawl. amongst people who are in their 70s and 80s who are still angry about the dissolution of this organization. And I was present for the funeral of Seymour Melman, which was another kind of reunion of the Avuka family. And there too, the emotions were running so high, it was absolutely amazing. The complexity of trying to tell this story, particularly given that most of the informants who I had to interview to understand it were in their 80s, 90s, and in the case of Tzvi and Shoshana Harris, hundreds, required this as one method for gathering information about this effort. But also others, which I want to show you briefly, because it will give you a sense of what it's like to do this kind of work.
And it was really...
Anyway, as a result of that meeting, I was impressed with that reading. I had never heard it before. I asked her out to dinner. That was our first date.
So now it's 66 years that they celebrated last week.
Stop it for a minute. In 1942, I was a counselor at camp, and Chester came up and he said, "We're getting married." I said, "Okay." So they gave me 3 days off, and we went to Boston, where we thought we could go out into the harbor and be married by a captain, so we wouldn't have to wait for 3 days. But it turns out that we could get into a British ship, but it involved being British citizen. It didn't work out. However, Millie and the group in Boston, the Avuka group, knew of a judge who signed something and dated it that the blood test was reflected that having been done, and we were married by Justice of the Peace in Boston. We had no...
So, I think it's being paused here. That is Chava Rapkin. You heard the name previously, Chester. Chester Rapkin was another member of Avuka, a very important member of Avuka, who became a professor of architecture and urban planning at Princeton. And he was kind of a ladies' man and so forth and so on. And Chava had been dating Murray, who you've already met, and also was interested in Chester. So when Chester asked her to marry him, she agreed. So, and as you can tell also from some of these images, a lot of these people are still together and they still share the work and the story and so forth with it. Chester Rapkin died, I think it's been quite a while, like 15 years or something ago. But he's responsible for saving Soho from destruction in New York City. The plan was to turn it into an industrial area or something, and he saved it from destruction. So there's a plaque in Soho devoted to Chester Rapkin, Chava's former husband. This became the one political statement that Zelig Harris landed up producing that describes some of the things that I'm talking about. Not so much the social Zionism, but certainly the socialism and such. It's a book that came out after his death in 1997. So we get back to the question that I posed at the beginning: why don't we know about this stuff? Why don't we know about the League for Jewish-Arab Rapprochement? Why don't we know about Avuka? Why don't we know about the early plans to develop Arab-Jewish relations in Palestine and spread socialism and so forth? One of the reasons was fear. Zelig Harris was desperately terrified of being arrested by American authorities and thrown into jail for his radicalism. He, like the members of the Frankfurt School, like other members of Avuka, as a Jew, and as, in many cases, communists or anarchists or some version thereof, were afraid of arrestation and kept their head down. He really kept his head down to the point where he never released a single text in his lifetime that describes some of the beliefs that I'm now describing to you. The only way that you can find them is either by reading the Avuka newspaper or by doing these kinds of interviews. Nonetheless, he was in 1994, 5, and so forth, putting together his thoughts for what he planned to be his first book, which is to be on politics. He had written many books on linguistics, called The Transformation of Capitalist Society. When he died, his work was picked up by a group of Avukaites, Seymour Melman, Bill Evans, Harold Orlands, who put it together and published this as a book, posthumously, making some revisions and so forth and so on. So some of the notions and ideas that I'm making reference to here are collected in this book that for some reason has disappeared from history. Like I said, there's not a whole lot in here about Palestine, but what there is in here is the idea that the seed for this future Palestine was to be sown by these kibbutz artzis, by kibbutzim which were built on socialist principles. So one of the plans that was made was to build these kibbutzim, this is pre-Israel, and to erect them on models of pure democracy, sharing of all decisions, sharing of all labor, elimination of hierarchy, and so forth and so on, and that those would become models for the future spreading of socialism through Palestine. So they were crucial. Another crucial idea, which is developed in here, in fact, in some detail, is the idea of the ESOP. The ESOP, which is, for those of you who have not seen one, the Employee Share Ownership Program, is when a company goes bankrupt in capitalism. The example that he gives is Pride Bakery that went bankrupt in Chicago. The workers then take over the means of production, take over the factory, which the owners are usually happy to get rid of anyway. They take it over and they then own the means of production and the output of their labor. And in so doing, they develop a new attitude towards the workplace. So this is why I need to tell this story so broadly, because you can see that the threads that are now beginning to be tied together. Workers develop a new attitude towards the means of production and towards their own production, which changes their relationship to work, but also changes their relationship to one another. And this idea is at the base not only of the transformation of capitalist society, but also at the basis of what this place called Palestine will look like. Because at this place called Palestine, you will have this as a model for your economic base rather than capitalism. And you will also not have a state. It is Zelig Harris in particular, but the Avuka group was against the idea of a state because of the horrors and dangers of nationalism. So that if the Arabs and Jews and Palestinians were to get along on different grounds, they'd have to do so on these types of principles. Finally, I want to give you one more vision. This is Millie Katz. She was the president of the New England chapter of Avuka. She became a professor of social work at Brandeis. And I just want to give you this last moment with her because of the power of the storytelling that goes into a project like this. If it is the case that you can go back in history and find perhaps solutions to problems by addressing questions of roads not taken, then there's an extremely important and valuable tool that we need to use, which is called storytelling. It's a crucial component. It's not just the portrayal of facts. There also has to be some sort of a methodology that's appropriate to something like an oral history. And this is a very long interview. I'm only going to give you a couple of minutes. But one of the things that I learned most powerfully from Millie was the power of silence.
So engaged as to meet themselves outside of the classroom, to care about things beyond their own selves, and to think in now that these kids were writing these stuff. It's so impressive to me. I mean, you were, of course, dealing with some very big questions.
Well, I was going to say the world is such
that time. I was trying to think, I'm not going to whether the Vietnam War, which did bring out a lot of feeling and a lot of political activity. I don't know. It was also the they were the distractions that there are now. We could focus on ideas that came from us. We didn't have things plugged in.
Ideas that came from us. And that, I think, is a really crucial component of what it is that we're describing here. The sense that if you put people together during an era of extreme risk and danger and so forth, and of course there's the era of 33 to 45 and beyond, then people will come up with solutions that are appropriate to their community. And that was, I think, one of the cornerstones of the idea of a VUCA. But I also want to add that some of what I've described here, which sounds dramatic and so different from, a two-party state or a two-state solution or whatever kinds of things are talked about now in the Middle East. When we go back to the historical documents, even some of the most well-known figures that you could that we know, when we read their words and we think of them relative to this VUCA work, it becomes very surprising. And I want to present this to you by way of conclusion as through the voices of two people, Albert Einstein and David Ben-Gurion. Albert Einstein has a very important connection to a VUCA. As I said, Zelig Harris ended up marrying his principal assistant, but it goes beyond that. In 1929, when Harris was 20 years old, Einstein decided to return to the U.S. He had been visiting the U.S. previously, but his idea, if you've ever read one of his biographies, his idea was to come here. His idea was to be in England, probably here at Oxford. But in 1929, he came to the U.S. instead. And he had specifically said to his friend Haber that he was going to the U.S. on account of American Jews. Einstein was a strong Zionist who also believed in Arab-Jewish relations. And when he came to the States in 1929, it was reported in December 1930 issue of VUCA's newspaper, we learned that en route, he accepted to make an address from his ship, the SS Belgenland, as it approached the American shore. What's remarkable is that this speech, scheduled for 9:30 a.m. on December the 11th, 1929, was going to be given to a VUCA. By then he was a superstar, and he was to become a much bigger superstar. At least by 1919, he was already world known. But in 1929, he came to the U.S., and solicited by all the major newspapers and so forth and so on to give a talk, he specifically said, I'm going to speak to a VUCA. He said, and to a VUCA, quote, the only organization under whose auspices he would make a public pronouncement upon his arrival to the U.S. In his address, which preceded Einstein's talk, the VUCA Executive Secretary George Hyman recalled that, quote, in the library of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem is deposited the original manuscript of Einstein's theory of relativity. This monumental document has revealed to the world a new truth, and it may well be that from Zion shall go forth to all humanity new values resulting from the development of a homeland in Palestine. Einstein then gave his greeting, and here is some of the things that he said. He said, my dear friends, I'm very happy to have this occasion and so forth and so on. And then, in the first place, we must pay great attention to our relations with the Arab people. By cultivating these relations, we shall be able to avoid a development in the future of those dangerous tensions which can be exploited for the purposes of provoking hostile actions amongst both parties. We can very well attain this end because our upbuilding of Palestine has been so conducted and must be so conducted that it also serves the real interests of Palestinians and Arabs. So all of a sudden, as you read Einstein's words and you think of the backdrop of VUCA, it sounds rather different. And then later, in 1929, the same year of his visit to the U.S., he wrote the following words to Weizmann. If we do not find the path to honest cooperation and honest negotiations with the Arabs, then we have learned nothing from 2,000 years of suffering, and we deserve the fate that will befall all of us. Above all, we should be careful not to rely too heavily upon the English. For if we don't get a real cooperation with the leading Arabs, then the English will drop us, if not officially, then de facto. And they will lament our debacle with traditional pious glances towards heaven, with assurances of their innocence, and without lifting a finger for us. So these kinds of statements, which seem surprising when you read his work on Zionism, again, in this backdrop, resonate in different kinds of ways. But even more surprising, I think, is a letter that I found in my endless questing and researching and finding stuff, from David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion's connection to Avuka is through Chava Rapkin, the woman who you met a few minutes ago. He used to come to Chava Rapkin's house because Chava's father was a leading intellectual in Palestine, and David Ben-Gurion depended very strongly upon him, Morris Samuels, upon his ideas and ideals for his conceptions of what the Palestinian state might look like. And he wrote, David Ben-Gurion did, a letter to Louis Brandeis, dated 6 December 1940, in which he tries to envision what this Palestinian state might look like. He says, so a letter from David Ben-Gurion to Louis Brandeis, dated 6 December 1940, sets forth the types of proposals that were on this table that stood between Jews and Arabs during the war. In discussion with Arab leaders, Ben-Gurion found that, quote, here's the letter, the Arab people as such, and especially those who represent the true national interests of the Arabs, would never willingly agree to hand Palestine over to the Jews or to share it with the Jews on the basis of equality. Musa Alami, who had been the Attorney General of Palestine, suggested to Ben-Gurion that the best solution would be, quote, economic and social cooperation with those Jews already in Palestine, rather than heavy Jewish immigration. And the proportion at that time, well, actually by then it was probably, it was a little bit, like in the early 30s, it was about 85% Palestinians and Arabs and 50% Jews. Ben-Gurion's preferred solution, which he proposed to Arab officials, was, quote, the idea of a federation between a Jewish Palestine and neighboring Arab states. The advantages, he says, are clear. First, the Arabs in Palestine, with a Jewish majority, though numerically a minority, would not feel that they were in a foreign state, as they belonged together with the whole of Palestine to a larger unit, which would be predominantly Arab. Second, they would have the political and economic help of the Jews in establishing Arab unity and independence in the greatest part of the Arab territory. And third, they would have the benefit of a highly developed Palestine as a member of the larger Arab federal unit. Again, that's David Ben-Gurion. It's a bit of a far cry from worldwide socialism proposed by Avuka, but you can see that the vision was one of Arab-Jewish cooperation, and certainly not one of a state as we now conceive of it, or now as we now see it being imposed. Of course, history never took this path, and everything that I've read up until now has ended in 1942. It is of course the case that it's a kind of, it is the result of the Holocaust and so forth, that negotiations took the form that they took subsequently, and the state took the form that it took in 1948. And then it may not have been imaginable that Menachem Begin would take it in the much more militaristic direction that it landed up going in. But the ideas in the early 40s were all built upon, even Ben-Gurion's ideas, some of the notions that we've been talking about here. And it was Zelig Harris's belief that AVUCA and AVUCA members should keep out of the war. His belief was that World War II was a war between two imperialist sides who were really battling on behalf of capitalism, and that with the end of World War II, that all powers would just become, capitalist, and therefore to fight on one side or the other was of little interest. But moreover, that what he was fighting for was, as I said, worldwide socialism, to begin with Palestine. So the degree to which these ideas have currency today is, of course, something to discuss. But I think that Louis Brandeis, Albert Einstein, Zelig Harris, with these, going back to these documents, offers shocking testimony of roads not taken, and maybe in the current discourse ways of looking past the contemporary impasse in Arab-Jewish relations. Thank you.